Gloucester History Festival.
Beams and the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III. And
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here if anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival.
The Gloucester History Festival Special Series on History with Jackson. All right, so hello everyone, welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast, and today we are joined by Rachel Trethewey to talk about her brand new book, Mother, the story of the Mitford girls' mother. But firstly, Rachel, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Good to be with you.
Now, I'm really excited to chat to you about this book, because I think the Mitford girls have been kind of shrouded in mythology for the last half a century, but why do you think that is?
I think they've just got it all. They're sort of glamorous, naughty, they're involved in politics, they're involved in social life, and there's just never a dull moment with them, so can't really go wrong. And they've got tragedy there, they've got comedy, it's got it all, really.
No, I certainly haven't read the book now. They've got everything, but what inspired you to write this book about their mother?
Well, I'd always been interested in the Mitfords. I think, when I was a teenager, I read The Pursuit of Love and Loving in a Cold Climate and loved it because it's just such a funny book. And then I read it again as I got older because it's always a good laugh. And I sort of looked at it differently then because to begin with, I was just taken in by the sort of glamour of it and thinking about the exciting, bright young things. But when I reread it, I thought, I was a mother at that time, and I thought, I wonder what it's like being the mother of girls like that. It must be a bit of a nightmare, really. And I also read Mary Lovell's book, which is brilliant, on the Mitford girls. And that made me even more interested in Sydney, their mother, because she sort of portrays her as a heroine of the whole story because she held everything together. So it had always been on my radar. And now it just sort of seemed the time to do it. The politics interested me too, because I think there are quite a lot of parallels between 1930s and our own era. So it had been in my mind for a long time, but now seemed to be the right time to write it.
No, and I definitely agree in the similarities between the era that they were speaking and getting involved in politics and now. But then when you're focusing on Sydney, it seems that it gives a whole different depth to the story. And I think a lot of Sydney's childhood seems to shape what goes on later. So what was her childhood like, and how pivotal was her father in shaping who she became?
You're absolutely right. That's what I found doing my research. I think one of the key people in this whole story is her father, Thomas Gibson Bowles, who was this illegitimate, charismatic, self-made man. And he was the founder and proprietor of two magazines, Vanity Fair and The Lady. And then he became a sort of maverick politician who would sort of switch from one party to another and had really strong views of his own and always thought he was right. And he gave Sydney a very interesting upbringing for a girl. Unfortunately, her mother died when she was only 7. So Thomas brought up his 4 children by himself. And he was a very hands-on father. But he treated his 2 daughters as though they were boys, really. They were put in sailor suits and went on all these sort of incredible adventures with him. And perhaps the most formative one was going on this sailing trip in their boat, the Nereid, and they went down through the Med and then through sort of around in storms. And Sydney really had to learn whether she could swim or sink, and she chose to swim. And this experience, I think, was very important to her in her life. I mean, later, in a very good obituary of her, she was described as like a master mariner. And I think she really was. She could be courageous, but she could also be very stubborn. And that all came from her father. She had a very unorthodox childhood in other ways too, because Thomas didn't believe in normal medicine. After his wife had died, he turned totally against it. And so if anything happened, they'd say, well, the good body will heal itself. And Sydney had this same approach with her daughters. He had strange dietary rules, was a very, very unusual, unorthodox character. And both his political views and his ideas on how to run a family were taken up by Sydney. And I think her father was much more important than her husband in shaping the woman she became. Her father always had to have a cause and a purpose. And I think that this passed on to the Mitford girls. I think that although they appeared as just sort of social butterflies to some people, they needed more in their lives. And that's why they pursued the extreme politics they went after.
And I definitely saw Sydney's father reflected in all of them, really. But then that unorthodox upbringing did seem to kind of make the transition for Sydney from child to adult a little bit more blurred. So how did she deal with that as a person, but also how did other people deal with her becoming an adult when they didn't really see her as such?
It was interesting because Thomas always took his two young daughters around with him. So he'd go to sort of literary soirees, and hostesses would be, well, why are you bringing your children? And he'd go, well, I bring them with me everywhere. And then from the age of 14, Sydney was running her father's household. And that was quite something for a Victorian young lady. And apparently she didn't get on very well with the male staff. So always afterwards, she'd have only female staff in her own household, no butlers, only sort of ladies' maids and parlour maids. So she learnt very young that she had to be in charge, she had to behave like an adult. But she didn't have a mother's influence. And I think this was very important. I mean, till she was about 17, she was still wearing a sailor suit. And in the marriage market of the era, it wasn't really very successful to be wearing a funny old sort of serge sailor suit, until a friend of Thomas's, a lady friend, sort of said to him, look, I think you've got to buy Sydney some decent clothes. You know, she's going round in a totally unsuitable outfit for her age. She also didn't learn the sort of feminine wiles, so she'd say to her suitors exactly what she thought. And then she didn't have a role model of how to bring up children at all. So it was trial and error with her own six. And I think, well, six girls and one boy. And I think she got better at it as she went along. And she was a bit insecure on doing that. So I think all those things made the transition from being a young girl and child to being a woman very, very difficult for her.
And you can certainly see the influence of not having her mother for most of her adolescent life to be quite difficult and have a lasting impact on her. But then you mentioned suitors. You know, she marries this fantastic man, David. I think he's an incredible character. But how does that come about, and what's that relationship like?
Good question. She fell in love first with her skating instructor, who was this dashing figure who, when you see photos of him in sort of these tight black tops and trousers, it's a bit like Oswald Mosley in his black shirt thing. So maybe there's a hereditary link there of what Diana went for. Sydney was very attracted to handsome men. She very much valued physical good looks and beauty. So the ice skating instructor very much appealed to her. However, she thought very seriously about it, and in her diary sort of weighed up pros and cons. And he really, not much happened with them, but she also thought she had to marry someone within her class, as she'd put it, and that she had to sort of think about where her position would be in the world. So that one wasn't going to last. She then fell deeply in love with someone called Jimmy Mead, who was a womanizer and roue, and we think he broke her heart, really. After that, I think the appeal of David Mitford was that he was exceptionally good looking, and he was also very, very loyal, and he would never be unfaithful to her. Like her, he hadn't been the favourite child, and he'd never had that much attention. And so I think they were both drawn together by that. And the other thing that brought them together was a great sense of humour. Sydney was in a family where a lot of jokes were told, but she didn't tell as many jokes herself. She told about 2 a year, which were known as sort of every 6 months joke. But she was very good at listening to other people's jokes, and she would laugh at them and be a very good foil for them. David was exceptionally funny, and he could impersonate people. It was like a double act, really, when he got together with someone who was very funny too, like his daughter Nancy. And so I think the sense of humour was very important. But David wasn't as cultured as Sydney was. He was very much a countryman. He loved his hunting, shooting and fishing, and was happiest, in an old tweed jacket, going around the Cotswold countryside. Sydney and her family had lived a much more urban life, and her father knew everyone from Lewis Carroll to Oscar Wilde's brother and artists. They were at the centre of political life. So she'd had a very different experience. And to begin with, I think she tried to perhaps change David. and introduce him to literature. She read him Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and yeah, he was really moved by it. He cried and everything, but he was absolutely appalled once she tried to comfort him by saying, well, it's just a story, it's fiction, it's not fact. And after that, he said he'd never read another novel because he wanted it to just be a factual story. So I think she gave up on his literary education. I think he was, certainly in the early years, always totally devoted to her. And he'd always tell her, even when she was middle-aged, how beautiful she was, that her hair was like molten gold. I think she was a bit cooler about him. And there were aspects of their marriage that were very difficult. David had a very, very fiery temper. They said his bark was worse than his bite, but his bark could be quite loud. And Sydney would just sort of go into chilly silence to cope with it and switch off. So that was difficult. Also, he wasn't very good at business, and so he lost loads of money, and the family were downwardly mobile. And if there was one thing Sydney always wanted, perhaps because of her difficult childhood, it was a stable home. And rather than having that, she had to move from one house to another with her husband. So it was a complicated marriage.
And that downwardly mobile element of their marriage, she really seemed to struggle with and have massive issues with David over that. How did the role of her father kind of come into that? Because David seems to be very different from the top man in her life, which is Thomas, her dad.
Exactly. Thomas knew what he was doing. He didn't start with a lot of money, although he had a father who was a cabinet minister, who took him under his wing, but he was illegitimate. And there were other children as well. So he had some money, but not a lot. But he had a lot of get up and go. And, he used what money he had to establish 2 very, very successful magazines that made a profit. And in fact, The Lady continued until this year. And he was able to sell Vanity Fair for a good amount of money. So her father knew what he was doing with money. Sydney also knew what she was doing with money because she'd run her father's household. She was a very good bookkeeper. And she also had a good business brain. She set up this farm business with hens and sold all her eggs to London clubs and things. And this was enough money to finance her daughter's education. She was very careful at budgeting and kept really good account books. For instance, she wanted her daughters to learn how to budget, but they were never really that interested in that. People like Diana, when she married an exceptionally wealthy man like Brian Guinness, sort of threw away the account book her mother gave her as a wedding present and did her own thing. But Sydney definitely knew what she was doing with money, having watched her father. And it must have been very galling for her watching David choose a lot of schemes that just were sort of complete white elephants. I mean, at one stage, when wirelesses, as they were called, or radios as we'd call them now, were new things, he thought they looked hideous. So he decided it would be really good to put them in caskets made of papier-mâché and things like the shape of an elephant or a sort of anything that would disguise it. And of course, this was a complete disaster. They were more hideous than the actual radio looked. He just didn't do well. He bought land that would be a gold mine in Canada, and they went out there to prospect for gold. And the neighbouring land, which belonged to someone else, they struck a lot of gold, and that man became one of the richest men in the country. Poor old David, there's no gold on his land, or just a few little sort of flakes of it. He wasn't lucky, but he was also gullible. And so if anyone came to him with a really stupid scheme, he'd probably invest in it. And he wouldn't consult Sydney, he'd just go ahead and do it. So you can see on both sides it was a little bit difficult.
Yeah, David definitely seems like that mate we all have, who we're heads are in hand, going, "What are you doing?" And I did feel like that reading about some of David's endeavours and some of his speeches. But then the central part of how we remember Sydney is her family and her girls. So, when David and her start having children, how did she imagine her life as a mother to be? Because she'd obviously not had that role model. But then how does that life actually materialise?
Well, I think like a lot of people, she wanted to give her children everything she'd felt she'd lacked. So she actually gave her children a very safe, stable childhood. but they found that incredibly boring and couldn't wait to break out of it. And I mean, at the very beginning, Sydney had always wanted sons. She wanted 6 sons. She got 6 daughters and just one son. And as I say, with no sort of maternal input from her mother, she had not much idea what to do with them. So from an early age, they were handed over to nannies. And her girls complained that she was very distant and not really there for them. But she did have 7 children to look after. And to be honest, I don't think she was very different from a lot of women I've written about of her generation and class. I wrote about Clementine Churchill and her daughters. And actually, Sydney was there a lot more than Clementine for her girls. But they really didn't appreciate it. They found her very vague, a bit cold and a bit distant. And she did always, I think, put her daughters first. But she was always sort of having to run around from one crisis to another. So once they got older, they couldn't wait to leave home. And they would just sort of couldn't wait to get out there and have a more exciting time. Because although they lived in the lovely Cotswolds and had these gorgeous houses and all their relatives around, it just wasn't enough for them. They were bored stiff. Sydney thought she'd done what she thought was right. And instead of them having a sort of nomadic existence like she'd had as a girl, they had all the stability they could want. But it was wrong for them. And so they rebelled big time.
It's very interesting seeing the girls have different opinions of their mother, but then the people around that family having very different opinions. So what were the extended family thinking of Sydney as a mother and her relationship with her children?
That's a really good point. You've read the book in detail, which is great. Basically, you know, the girls had very divided opinions of them. Half of them thought she was wonderful. And then Jessica and Nancy were very, very critical of their mother. Jessica became less so as she grew older. Nancy never really got on very well with Sydney. And unfortunately for Sydney, the best writers in the family, or the most famous ones, were the ones who were critical of her. Debo, the youngest, absolutely adored her mother and said how selfless she was. And Diana, although she had run-ins with her mother when she was younger, grew to love her very, very much too. And then Pam was pretty neutral about it. And Unity was always close to her mother. So they were divided completely about it. But the wider family did see it differently. And her niece, Julia, thought that actually Sydney was much better than the other mothers in the family. She thought, you know, most of them were more concerned about their dogs and horses than their children and were pretty useless. So I think there is very much a generational thing going on here, that women had to put their husbands first, and that didn't always leave a lot of energy or time for their children. And also it was the sort of done thing to hand them over to nannies. So I think Sydney did her best, but she wasn't a sort of huggy, warm person. And I've also seen that when I've written about people like Clementine Churchill, but also about Queen Mary with her children. And I don't think that meant that these women didn't love their children. They just weren't sort of effusive and able to express that very well. They were a bit repressed. So you can't help feeling a bit sorry for these sort of mothers.
I certainly did see Sydney as a mother trapped between different eras and different approaches. And I found that split with her daughters to be very, very interesting. So how does the rise of extremist ideologies, 1920s, 1930s, hit the family and then hit Sydney's relationship management of different relationships?
It completely divides the family with the politics. They split from, sort of Jessica a communist and then Diana and Unity becoming fascists. And Sydney, of course, wants to get on with all her daughters. She loves them all, but she's naturally far to the right. But she moved very gradually on this sort of right-wing journey. Obviously, her father was right-wing, and although he had some sort of very individualistic views, but he started as a conservative, he moved around, and unfortunately he had pretty abhorrent anti-Semitic comments he made. So she was brought up in an environment which sort of laid the ground for the later views of the family, I think. And so in the 1920s, Sydney was very involved in the Conservatives. And for her, after the Russian Revolution, her great fear was Bolshevism. So, when things like the general strike happened, they were afraid there'd be revolution in this country. So she was a stalwart of the local Conservatives, put on fetes, campaigned. She went to Conservative conferences. She was interested in the ideas. But at that stage, she was pretty mainstream. Then in the 1930s, the daughters wanted something that inspired them, because they all wanted attention in one way or another. And also they were looking for a purpose in life. They were, after all, Thomas's granddaughters. They went to the extremes. So Diana ended up married to Oswald Mosley, and Unity went to Germany and fell completely under the spell of Hitler, whereas Jessica eloped to the Spanish Civil War and was a communist. Sydney naturally went to the right. It happened gradually. To begin with, she thought the Nazis were a bunch of thugs. But when Hitler was nice to her daughter and Sydney was introduced to Hitler, she was totally taken in by him. And that was the thing. There was a gullible element to her. And I think that she wouldn't listen to other people's opinions. Once she got an idea in her head, she just held on to her own ideas, even when it was quite obvious that Hitler was doing terrible things. She just saw it as propaganda. And I think in a way her favourite daughters were right-wing. They were like her, and she went along with them. But it was really divisive, because both Jessica and Nancy were naturally appalled that their mother and father in the 1930s could begin to support Germany and Hitler. And they were even more so when their mother continued to support Hitler and admire him, both during and after the war. So it completely split her family.
And she seems to have had a very hard time trying to manage those relationships and maintain being a mother with her political views. So how does David also kind of make the situation worse in the family?
Well, David is sort of more erratic than Sydney. The trouble with Sydney is once she gets hold of a view, she won't let go of it. And equally, if she was loyal to someone, she wouldn't let go of that loyalty, even that if that was totally the wrong thing to be. Whereas David would change from one thing to another. So he'd never been very political. I don't think he was as political as Sydney, but he did have a seat in the House of Lords. And so after the war, First World War, in which he fought very bravely, he absolutely hated the Germans, called them Huns, and would, sort of say that there wasn't any such thing as a good German. But his attitude changed in the 90s, and he went over to Germany. They flattered him because nobody had ever taken much notice of him politically over here. And he became one of the peers in the House of Lords who actually championed Hitler rather appallingly. And he, however, always claimed he just didn't want another war. He wanted there to be Anglo-German friendship. So he was involved in organisations like the Anglo-German Fellowship, and then more controversially, organisations like the Link and the Right Club, which were really very controversial. However, as soon as the war began, he turned totally against the Germans and became patriotic. And his daughter Nancy said, was more against Hitler and the Germans than anyone else pretty much could be. And in the 1930s, he would never meet Mosley. He disapproved of Mosley as his son-in-law, so he never met him and called him that man. But when the war broke out and he turned his views completely on their head, he didn't want anything really to do with Sydney's views anymore. And so their marriage really was totally damaged by their political beliefs. Sydney could no longer live with David. They rowed all the time. And David decided that he couldn't stand living either with his wife's political views or with Unity, his daughter, who had shot herself at the beginning of the war and was now very much an invalid and needed looking after. So David left Sydney and went to live on a remote Scottish island with the parlour maid, Margaret Wright. So the marriage was broken up by the politics ultimately.
And I wanted to dive into that episode there with Unity, because I know a lot of focus has been given in recent years on Unity's relationship with Hitler. But there's an extra layer there with Sydney's relationship with Hitler, because as any mother would, if you see a man or see anyone exhibit the level of care towards your own child as Hitler does towards Unity, you're going to build a relationship or some form of loyalty there. So could you just let us know about that, please?
Yes, I think that is part of the picture. It was personal as much as political, although that seems absolutely awful to us, when it's Hitler. But basically, unity had always been a great worry to Sydney. She'd always been the problem child. She always behaved oddly. She'd have to leave schools, where she was. She never found her place in British society. When she was a debutante, she'd go to parties at Buckingham Palace and take her snake with her and a rat, and then steal the notepaper. It was a constant concern to Sydney about what would happen to Unity. And then in 1933, Diana took Unity to Germany, and suddenly Unity felt she'd found where she belonged. And Sydney actually wrote to Jessica saying, well, Unity's finally found her spiritual home. Unfortunately, that was with the Nazis. So Hitler sort of courted Unity. At first, Unity stalked him, but then he met her and he either found her attractive or maybe he thought she was useful because she was away into the British aristocracy. And so she was very much in his inner circle, and she was absolutely obsessed with him, as her recently published diaries show. And Hitler also wanted to meet her parents. And so Lady Redesdale met Hitler, and he was really nice to her and even interested in her pet obsession about wholemeal bread. So they sort of bonded over that sort of thing. But also when Unity was ill with pneumonia, Hitler got her his doctor, rather controversial doctor, and made sure she was nursed. And then later, when at the beginning of the war, Unity shot herself because she couldn't bear seeing Britain and Germany going to war with each other, Hitler again visited her in hospital and sort of was kind to her. And because Sydney was so devoted to her children and Unity had always been such a problem, I think that is part of the reason that she was so misguidedly loyal to Hitler.
And it shows the complexity to the situation that we don't often appreciate the nuance within it. But then, the press, very much like they are today, obviously have a story there. So how do they approach this? But then how does Sydney respond as someone who has this, fantastic kind of PR background?
Yeah, well, I mean, the press were very, very interested in the Mitfords. These 6 sort of glamorous, naughty girls were absolutely perfect for the papers. And Sydney used to say in the 1930s, every time she saw a headline saying Pierre's daughter, she wondered what the hell her daughters had done then. So it was a bit of a worry to Sydney, although David enjoyed publicity a bit more, I think, came across. He quite liked the publicity, although some of it was really bad. And Sydney liked using the newspapers to write letters to. She'd write them about weird things like the importance of, wholemeal bread, that was really important. I mean, it's not weird to like wholemeal bread, but the way Sydney promoted it was a bit over the top. And she also had her hobby horses, like her father, about things like cows didn't really need to be tested for tuberculosis and you could drink the milk anyway. And she'd write about that. Or she'd write about home education. But as the 90s went on, she'd also write sort of supporting Hitler and absolutely not taking any notice of the facts and just using the propaganda that she'd obviously got from Germany. And so she'd write letters which were, not factual at all and promoted Hitler. However, the situation became more difficult when Unity came back to Britain in the war, having shot herself. And of course, it was a massive story. The press wanted to cover every sort of detail of Unity's return. And Sydney had gone across Europe to collect her brain damaged daughter from Switzerland. And she brought her back on trains and on the ferry and everything. And when they got back to England, there was a massive crowd of journalists there. And the ambulance that was meant to take Unity home broke down. There were all these photos of her. But Sydney was incredibly protective of Unity. And when the press asked her anything, she said, I do not want my daughter to be portrayed as a tragic heroine. She had sort of this pride. And I think her husband David felt that actually they'd have had more sympathy if Sydney had been more open about the extent of Unity's brain damage and the situation they were in, because Unity was never the same girl again. She was doubly incontinent. I mean, she was strange. before she shot herself, but afterwards she was just very, very weird. She had religious obsessions and, she would say very, very odd things. But Sydney, as a mother, was incredibly protective of her and wanted to keep her away from the press. David did his own thing and contacted the press to make sure that they knew he did not support Hitler and that he would object to anyone saying that he still did during the war and that he hadn't met Mosley. So he was very keen to distance himself from his wife and daughter at this point.
And that represents an incredibly difficult time, not just for Sydney, but that whole family. And when David and Sydney have effectively split up, Sydney's life revolves around Unity. So where does she go to protect her daughter, and how does her life change from that moment?
Yeah, I mean, Sydney's life totally changed from being sort of lady of the manor, with a beautiful manor house at Astle, although, and then another very big house near there at Swinbrook, all these in the Cotswolds. And Sydney goes to live in the fishing cottage near a mill pond next to the pub in Swinbrook. And I mean, it's a very pretty place. I've been to see it, don't get me wrong, but it was a big change. And she had to do everything for Unity. When Unity first came home, Sydney slept in with her. So she was there when she woke. Sydney had to look after her and do all the laundry because she's doubly incontinent. So every morning she'd have to wash all the sheets, hang them out to dry, do all those sort of things. She just totally dedicated her life to trying to get her daughter better. And, she'd do sort of tutoring of her so that she could read and write again. And her whole life was about Unity. David couldn't stand it. He had never liked anything that was very messy. When the children were small, if they spilt jam on the table, he'd get really worked up and annoyed. So, someone in the state Unity was in was just something he couldn't cope with. So I think that's another of the reasons, as well as the politics, that he found it better going off to this remote island in Scotland and living away from them. But Sydney, as a mother, couldn't walk away from it. And so she just got on with it.
Then with having, a number of girls who've got very different views on their mother, very different views on who the favourite is, how does this impact her relationship with her other daughters? Because obviously the war's over, Mosley's still part of the family, these political beliefs are still there, but at the end of the day you've got a very very injured daughter who needs care and support from a family.
Absolutely. Jessica and Diana could never really be reconciled. Diana was married to Mosley still, as you point out, and Mosley was still political. Jessica had gone to live in America, first of all with her first husband, Esmond, and then with a civil rights lawyer. And she and her second husband were busy campaigning, against any forms of fascism. They were also, as communists, under threat under the McCarthyite regime in America. And Jessica did care about her mother, but she would never really have much to do with Diana. And she could never forgive really what had happened. Her first husband, who she adored, Esmond Romilly, died fighting fascism. And she really blamed the fascists in her family for what had happened. However, Jessica was reconciled with her mother, and Sydney really worked at it. She would always write to Jessica, and one of the wonderful things writing this book was I was able to see the letters that Jessica and Sydney had exchanged. And Sydney's letters to her are very, very loving, and Jessica gradually becomes more loving back. And Sydney was so keen to be reconciled with Jessica that in 1948 she flew out to America and went to stay with Jessica and met all Jessica's communist friends, and they actually rather liked Sydney. They found her a great character. And I think Sydney did a careful balancing act. She only said what people wanted to hear in the letters. She'd keep off politics with Jessica. I haven't been able to see, because they are under embargo. They're not opened, I think, till 1963, the letters to the rest of the daughters. So I don't know what she was saying politically to them, and if it was different, it may well have been. But certainly she was very careful what she said to Jessica. And eventually Jessica did come back and visit her mother and chosen ones among her family in Britain and bring her children over. And she found that her attitude to Sydney had changed quite a lot. She said she wasn't sure whether Sydney had mellowed or she had, but they sort of met as two mothers, because Jessica now had children too, and Jessica actually, like her mother, lost two children. Two of her children died, and I think those things bonded them. And Jessica wrote to Nancy that actually she now really rather adored Sydney.
And it was nice. It was really nice reading that transition in Sydney's relationship with her daughters, but also seeing Sydney become a grandmother and a great-grandmother. What was she like with this new set of her family, which played a massive role in her older age?
Yes, actually, when they were younger, her children had preferred David because he was much more fun and he'd romp with them. And even though he could get really cross and be, sort of really shouty, they found him sort of warmer and more human than Sydney. But as they got older, they realised that the person who was always there for them was their mother. And she was always doing this triage of rushing between one or the other when they needed anything. If one had a miscarriage, she'd be there. If another one was ill, she'd immediately be there. She always sort of was there for them. But with the next generation, again, it did divide a bit, I think, ideologically. Certainly, Jonathan Guinness, who was Diana's son, has very, very fond memories of his grandmother. And he knew her very much as an adult. And he said, she was a real rock. She was there for him during the war while his mother was in prison. And later on, he said, he learnt a lot from her, her sort of resilience and her courage inspired him. And also they shared a love of the sea. Jessica's children didn't know her as well, and I was lucky enough to speak to them too, Constantia, or Dinky, and Ben. And they would come and meet their grandmother either on her one visit to America, or then they'd go up to the Scottish Islands and see her there, or in London. And they never really got to know her as much. They found her a bit more of a cool figure. She didn't seem as warm. And also there was still, when they were together, although they got on better, there was still tension between Jessica and her mother. It was always a bit treading on eggshells. So, like the daughters, the grandchildren are a bit divided on how they see Sydney. But, they find her interesting character to have in their past.
Again, as I said, it was a really interesting reading their opinions of her as opposed to just the media kind of mythology. But then, her daughters, as you've said already, some of her daughters become writers and their work is incredibly popular. How does she respond to these kind of depictions of herself in their work? And how do others respond to it as well? Because obviously there's this extended family that are going to read this work.
Yes, that became very controversial and quite upsetting for her in her older age, because basically Nancy was the most famous writer with her novels, which was a big hit, The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. And in that, she portrays her mother as Aunt Sadie. And Aunt Sadie is sort of this ineffectual woman who sort of drifts around, a bit one-dimensional, not as much fun and not as interesting as Uncle Matthew, who is based on David, Lord Redesdale. So I think she could cope with that just about. But she found it harder in her final years when Jessica brought out Ons and Rebels, which is an actual memoir of her childhood. And she didn't want to alienate Jessica, so she'd be out of touch again. So she only made very minimal changes to it and a few suggestions, like saying that actually she and her husband had not been driven around in a sort of chauffeur-driven Mercedes when they visited Hitler, because David would only go round in his Morris car. It was small things like that. But what really upset her was Nancy wrote an article, which then appeared in a book, about her nanny, Blore, saying, how great her nanny was and how useless her mother was, basically. By this stage, Sydney was an old lady with Parkinson's, and this really hit her because she said, goodness, I can't change those things now. It feels as though my whole life has had no purpose if I was such a useless mother. And this again totally divided the daughters, because Diana and Debo, who were devoted to their mother, and Pam were really outraged that Nancy should upset their mother in her later years when she was elderly. So that was a real problem. And there were some very sort of acid reviews about the book saying that people like David and Sidney probably shouldn't have had children, or the children should have been taken away from them. And I think there was one particular review in the Times Literary Supplement which really annoyed Diana. And Diana wrote a reply to it. And again, this was very divisive among the sisters. Nancy and Jessica didn't really want to upset their mother. And I think they did feel apologetic, and they did keep in touch. They all visited still, because Sidney couldn't bear to be separated from them, and they were all really close, really. But it was very, very difficult, and this was in her final years.
So with that division between her daughters, does Sidney's last couple of years, when she's going through Parkinson's, they know the end's close, does that unite her daughters?
It does. I mean, she died with all her daughters except Jessica there, and Jessica would have come if she could have come in the time. And actually, it's this sort of amazing scene you get, because Sidney, in her final years, liked to spend half of the year up at Inchkenneth, the island, the remote island they owned in Scotland. And she was up there when she became terminally ill, and all the daughters rushed to be up there, and it was a very stormy time. They couldn't get off the island, so they were all sort of trapped there, facing all their emotions and everything. And I mean, Sidney kept her sense of humour pretty much to the end. She was still laughing at what Nancy was saying to her. She'd say to Nancy, "Look, if you don't like my will, just change it." And Nancy said, "Well, if we do that, we'll go to prison, Muff. We can't do that." And she'd laugh at that. And, some of her great-grandchildren were there, so they were all around her. And when she died, I mean, it was really hard for all of them. Nancy said she thought nothing lovely would ever happen again, in a way. And Jessica was really hit by it, as were Diana and Debo and Pam. She had been this sort of force which had held the whole family together, and such a strong influence on them all that, I think even though they were, well into their middle age, it was a big loss.
Yeah, and I think this is the right time now, Rachel, to ask you our final fun questions we do for every guest here on the podcast. Having researched the Mitfords and Sidney's unorthodox kind of approaches to life, what do you think was the most unorthodox approach that she had?
Well, from my point of view, I think it was her medical approach, because she just would say whatever happened to her children, if they'd fallen out of a tree and broken their arm, or if they'd got pretty much anything but an appendicitis, well, the good body will just heal itself. She just wasn't concerned about it. She wouldn't get doctors in. Now, having been a mother myself, I don't have quite that approach. So for me, that seems really, really strange. But actually it worked, because all her children grew up pretty strong and healthy. So maybe she got it right and I've got it wrong. I don't know.
No, I do agree to some extent. That one is pretty unorthodox. I think that's a good one. And then obviously, if people want to go away and grab a copy of the book and interact with you, where can they go?
Well, it's going to be out on the 18th of September, and hopefully it'll be available at all good bookstores. It's certainly available at Waterstones. It's at Amazon. And as I say, please buy it, and I will be interested to know what anyone thinks of Sidney, because she was a conundrum to me. I mean, it was an emotional roller coaster writing about her, and I'd like to see what people think when they've read it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Rachel. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's been great.
At Gloucester History Festival.
Beams in the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III, and
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here. If anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival,
the Gloucester History Festival Special Series on History with Jackson.